Hello, everyone, and welcome to Coast Talks for today. My name is Jason Goldsworthy. I'm the Executive Director for Coast and today's host and moderator. Firstly, I'd just like to say I'm speaking from the territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, today known as the Esquimalt and Songhees Nations. Before we get on to today's topic, just a little bit about Coast for those of you who are new to this. Coast is the Centre for Ocean Applied and Sustainable Technologies, and we're Pacific Canada's hub for innovation and skills development. We're helping industry find new commercial solutions to key challenges facing our oceans today. We're supporting startups and new ventures to commercialise innovations to support those key challenges. We're engaging Indigenous leadership in ocean innovation, and we're attracting talent, capital and partnerships to grow businesses right here in British Columbia. Today's topic on Coast Talks is Blue Tech Solutions to Coastal Challenges. Our oceans have taken the brunt of human-driven climate change, absorbing up to 90% of the heat generated by global warming. The resulting rise in sea levels, marine heat waves, ocean acidification and coastal storms and erosion is driving marine biodiversity loss and affecting the livelihoods of communities along BC's coastlines and also the world's coastlines. Today, we're exploring the challenges our oceans are currently facing and find out how ocean tech companies are providing some of those solutions. We're very excited to have three fantastic panelists today. Joshua Charleson from the Coastal Restoration Society, Thomas Storwick from Coastal Carbon AI, and Ranah Chavoshi from PhyCo Technologies. First of all, we're going to hear from Josh Charleson, who's going to give us a little bit about the Coastal Restoration Society. Josh is a senior project manager with the Coastal Restoration Society. He grew up in the Heshkowitz community of Hot Springs Cove, which fostered his deep love and connection to the ocean, shorelines, rivers, and everything that water connects in the New Chalmouth territories. He's worked in fisheries management, tourism, land use planning as a Heshkowitz chief councillor, and most recently as the relationships director for the Coastal Restoration Society. I'm going to hand it off to Josh now, and we're going to listen to his talk on the Coastal Restoration Society. Thanks, Josh, for being here.
Good morning. Thank you, Jason. Thank you for the introduction. Oklas, Hasikwayat, Kinkwashtakonth Heshkowitz. My name is Joshua Charleson. I'm from the Heshkowitz First Nation and part of the Kinkwashtakonth clan. I work as Coastal Restoration Society's relationship director and also as a senior project manager. And I'm coming to you today from the traditional territories of the Hupetchesett First Nation and the Tshot First Nation. So just a little background on Coastal Restoration Society. Coastal Restoration Society was formed in 2017 with 5 employees. Since then, we've now grown to over 300 employees in the height of our projects. Coastal Restoration Society has removed over 12,000 pounds of marine debris to date, has cleaned over 550 kilometers of coastal shoreline, and has removed over 500,000 European green crabs, which is an invasive species here on our west coast. Coastal Restoration Society projects include derelict vessel removal, industrial shoreline cleanups, abandoned aquaculture remediation, ghost gear removal, climate emergency response, invasive species removal, Indigenous community revitalization, and a lot more that I won't go into detail about. But Coastal Restoration Society is proud to be a First Nations first organization, putting Indigenous communities and peoples first in all aspects of the planning and implementation of all of our projects. So the problem, I want to kind of describe the problem that we are facing and what we are trying to solve. So we are remediating environmental damages that have been caused by the past 150 years of industrial use of our coastal waters in Canada, which has led to pollution, introduction to invasive species, a reduction and near depletion of natural resources that have provided coastal communities, families throughout millennia. And this impact over the last 150 years of industrial use has had huge social impacts that come along with it. So for coastal communities, these impacts include displacement, a loss of identity, a loss of intergenerational knowledge transfer, and a loss of opportunity. So what we do as Coastal Restoration Society with our First Nations partners and our host nations is we are bringing opportunity back. into these small coastal communities. And how we're doing that is by bringing high-paying employment opportunities. We're providing training. We're providing work experience to these remote coastal communities. And we want to ensure that we're doing it in the safest way possible. We have a very strong occupational health and safety framework and a really good training pathway for people to become restoration technicians in this field. And by bringing these opportunities back to coastal communities that are experiencing these job losses due to climate change and overharvesting of our resources in the oceans and also in the forests, we're bringing that capacity back to these small remote communities that have been experiencing all of these huge social impacts because of the state of our oceans now. I just want to ensure that to get the point across that all of this starts with the First Nations and Indigenous peoples in Canada. We implement all of our projects in full partnership. We don't do anything without the blessing of any of our First Nations hosts, and all of the resources that we are able to obtain through governmental grants go directly back into the communities that we work in. I think that's it for me. I'll pass it on back to Jason.
Thanks, Josh. I'll leave my questions. I've got a few here I've come up with for after the session for Thomas and Ranah as well. But thank you for that little heads up on the Coastal Restoration Society. I've actually spent some time with some of your colleagues as well, and it's a fantastic initiative, and you guys are doing fabulous work, not only here in BC but also on the East Coast. So we'll get back to you towards the end, and I've got a few questions, and I'm hoping we'll get some questions from the audience as well. Our next guest is Thomas Storwick. He is the co-founder of Coastal Carbon AI, where he works to enable blue carbon and ocean restoration at scale. Before becoming an entrepreneur, Tom was previously a Next 36 Fellow, a graduate student in nanotechnology engineering at the University of Waterloo, and past researcher at Xerox and Harvard. Now he's into the blue economy and carbon capture. I'm going to pass it on to Tom, who's coming from Waterloo. Thanks for being here, Tom, and off to you.
Yeah, Jason, thanks for having me. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do, how we work in BC, and how we think about the blue carbon space. So thanks for having me out. And I'd just like to start off by sort of acknowledging my co-founder here, because everything we do has been a partnership. So I'm going to talk a lot about what we've done and everything, and I want to sort of keep it in your mind that everything I say, half this work was done by Kelly. So we've all seen this graph, right? And so this is a graph that gets passed around a lot about what we would need to do to make a reasonable global warming light version of Earth happen by 2100. But the way I actually like to think about this, and it puts it in a little perspective, is looking at this, which is the annual emissions of each country per year over the last 100 years. And so if we're going to decarbonize the planet and do so relatively quickly, in the next 10, 15 years, we need to come up with an industry that is equal to the carbon, an industry reducing CO2, that is equal to the carbon emissions of all of these countries put together. And then on top of that, make a new one that is equal, that can undo all of the cumulative emissions that we put out into the atmosphere by basically 2050, but probably really 2040. And so that's a massive challenge. And so why we're using the oceans to solve this is because basically we need to use everything. And so that gives you sort of a sense of scale and the urgency we're working with. And so specifically, we're looking at ocean-based carbon. And we call this sort of ocean-based coastal carbon in coastal ecosystems, and that gets sort of lumped under the term blue carbon, but there's a couple other pieces involved here. But what I really want to highlight with this graph is that it's all over the place. And so we talk about generally 4 types of blue carbon. There's mangroves, salt marshes, seagrasses, and seaweeds. There's some investigation into coral reefs, but how much carbon they sequester is not really fully understood yet. But if you look at this graph, there's one sort of glaringly obvious thing, is that it's all over the place, and it's mostly in hard to access locations. So it's a really interesting, and we'll talk about this probably a little more later, but it's a really interesting opportunity for coastal communities, where normally industries and really high value items are put in areas of high densities of people. But most of where you have some of the best blue carbon in the world is, along the coast of BC in very low population areas. And so it's a really good way to involve and engage local communities to sort of manage their local ecosystem in a carbon-friendly way and gain credit for that. And so then we started looking at that and looking at, all right, how does a coastal community get credit for it? How, if you have a coastal community and you have a seaweed ecosystem that you'd like to triple in size and then sell the offsets of that as carbon credits, what do you need? And you need someone to measure and verify it. And looking back at this graph, we knew we needed a solution that could equally work as well off the coast of Alaska, all the way over in Bali, to the southern coast of Australia, and then Japan, China, etc. And so there's really only one technology that works at that kind of scale, and that's satellite imagery. And so we started Coastal Carbon to do the measurements and verifications to give anyone in the world the opportunity to use their local ecosystem as a source of carbon sequestration and income for them. At the same time, we were reaching out to a bunch of people doing seaweed sequestration to try and learn from them. And we kept hearing one thing back, which is, we'd love to do that for carbon, but can you also just do that for us regularly? Because, so this is a partner of ours, his name is Michael. He's actually in the orange jacket right here. And he just has a really annoying time finding out how much seaweed is on his farm and growing regularly. And that's because he has to haul up all this heavy chain to do measurements of it. And so at the same time, we took the same technology, and now we're also starting to offer it for just seaweed farmers directly doing measurements. And so this is sort of a quick example of what that looks like. We can take regular satellite images, we can do some fancy AI modeling to make the invisible visible and take out the seaweed from space and then do some accounting of that. And that's us. We're Coastal Carbon, and we're measuring ecosystems from space to help climate change.
Thanks, Tom. It's amazing, this blue economy. There's all these different technologies. Here you are from nanotechnology getting into the ocean space. It's brilliant to see these different people getting involved, and it's exciting from our end. So thanks, Tom. I got some questions for you, but I'm going to reserve them for later because our final guest is Ranah Chavoshi, who is a marine biologist with expertise in aquatic toxicology and phycology, otherwise known as the study of seaweeds. She is the co-founder of PhyCo Technologies, Inc., which focuses on developing earth-digestible and non-toxic bio-based plastic alternatives. Ranah has worked in ecological restoration, environmental education and stewardship throughout her career and mainly in the non-profit sector. We're excited to have Ranah here to tell us about PhyCo Technologies. Welcome, Ranah.
Thank you, Jason, for that lovely introduction. I'm really grateful and honored to be here. And let me just share my screen so I'll get my presentation started. So thank you for having me. I'm calling in from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I'm really grateful to be on these lands as a guest, as a settler, because I'm privileged to work and play here as well and learn. So I'm one of the co-founders of PhyCo Technologies, Inc. We're a marine biotechnology company. I'll be speaking on behalf of my co-founder, Dr. Stacy Goldberg, as well, since there's two of us leading the helm. So the problem that we're dealing with is a global issue. Plastic pollution has been ongoing since the 1950s, and we've been producing 8.8 billion tons since that time. This photo that you're looking at was taken by me in 2016 of Semporna, Malaysia. And what you're looking at is the first time that I saw a sea of plastic as a result of overproduction of petroleum-based plastics and a lack of waste management. And Canada produces 3.3 million tons of plastic waste per year, and we contribute to this global issue. Only 9% of the plastic produced in Canada is actually recycled. The rest ends up in landfill, goes to waste energy facilities, gets exported to developing countries, or unfortunately, in the worst case, ends up in the environment. So we've got a very big problem that we're dealing with. And many sectors contribute to this problem, but one that we've identified as a large contributor is the agriculture and agri-food industries. So Canadian farmers rely on 62,000 tons of plastic products and packaging to feed us every year. And of the 1.9 million tons of plastic packaging produced in Canada, 760,000 tons is utilized for food packaging. If we're thinking in a marine kind of theme today, that's about the weight of 6 blue whales, which is quite large. And with speaking with farmers and people who are in our food systems, there are multiple pain points that they're experiencing currently. One is actually a positive pain point, I would argue. It's federal regulation. So the Canadian federal government has put in a strategy for zero plastic waste by 2030 and cutting out excess plastic. Last year, they introduced the single-use plastics ban, which was a consumer-facing plastics ban. They banned 10 items. And in that strategy as well, there's a push to find compostable alternatives as well as higher recycled content materials. So that's one of the pain points. The other two that we've seen through folks that we've been working with and speaking with is the cost of waste management. The cost of disposing plastic is getting more and more expensive, and it's harder to find good quality plastic to recycle. And there's a lot of pressure from consumers to reduce plastic packaging. Consumers are becoming more aware. They're aware of greenwashing and different forms of sustainable packaging. So they're becoming more critical and want to see less packaging as a whole. So what we do is that we're a marine biotechnology company focused on seaweed aquaculture in partnership with Indigenous nations and utilizing that seaweed to manufacture earth digestible and non-toxic plastic specific to the agriculture and agri-food sectors. So what we do is we grow seaweed in partnership with Indigenous nations to develop this compostable and bio-based non-toxic plastic. However, when we were doing this, we realized that there's another issue. Not all households are created equal. Not everyone has access to a home compost where they could put our products in and have them break down in 4 weeks. And not every jurisdiction has access to a composting facility. So what we're working on in tandem is a focus on the end of life of our product. So we're developing an enzymatic degradation technology that would accelerate the breakdown of our products with the ultimate goal of actually reusing it in a biocircular economy. So we want to close the loop on our products and see if we can actually reuse them as the ultimate goal for what we're doing. And so what we're developing is something similar to a polyethylene or a low density polyethylene. It's one of the most commonly used types of packaging that's in the food supply chain. And our film will have applications in food packaging, food production, grocery retail, and distribution. There's multiple uses of what we're developing. You're probably wondering why seaweed. So seaweed is native to our coastline in British Columbia. We have 25,000 kilometers of coastline. We're not going to be able to farm all of it. We shouldn't. We should be tactical and strategic about how we do it and be very selective for which sites we choose. But on top of that, it's low maintenance as a crop. It doesn't require the input of chemical fertilizers or pesticides. It's fast growing depending on the species that you're using as a crop. And while it grows, it actually sequesters carbon, which helps us mitigate climate change in a localized place-based effort as well. So our impact, our impact and our values are based off of the UN SDGs. So we're based off 4 here for responsible consumption. Our products are going to reduce the amount of actual plastic going into landfills, and we're moving towards a biocircular economy where we close that plastics loop or those alternative bio-based plastics loops. We're focused on reduced inequalities. We're very focused on equity and our respectful partnerships with Indigenous nations. So we're trying to create an innovative space that fosters kindness, respect, and supports diverse communities. We're very focused on climate action, of course. We're trying to minimize our carbon footprint, use seaweed aquaculture as a tool for mitigation, and working with Indigenous nations specifically to develop economic resiliency in a lot of the coastal communities that are often impacted by climate change first. And lastly, I'm a marine biologist, so life below water is essential. I think it is critical for our survival as human beings. So we have a holistic long-term sustainability vision that minimizes environmental impact. We want to operate respectfully in the ocean. So we believe seaweed can be an equitable climate and plastic pollution solution. And we've been really fortunate to be supported by the Canadian landscape of innovation and entrepreneurship. So these are just some of the folks that we've been receiving mentorship funding as well as our network. So we want to say thank you to them for their genuine support. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ranah. It's fantastic. I love how not only just focusing on the initial technology, but also the back end for the degradation, because it's a key component. Thank you all. Ranah, Tom, and Josh, if you can put your cameras back on there, we're going to start opening everything up for some questions. Thank you for your time today. We've got quite a few people online, so if you're wanting to pose a question to one of our great panelists, please put that in the chat session or the question and answer session. I'm going to kick it off with a couple of questions, but I think it was a good theme today, Josh, talking about the problems that I guess that you're seeing and some of the history that we're having to deal with at the moment over the 150 years of industrial uses of our oceans. You guys are doing fantastic work in cleaning that up as a reaction. How do you think we should move forward with new work in the oceans? We're going to continue to work with our oceans and treat them as assets, but how do we ensure that we're not creating more problems for the future, and how do we effectively take CRS and remove their requirement to come back and clean up in the end? I mean, we want to move towards not having the potential same impact that we've had for 150 years. I was hoping you might be able to comment on that.
Yeah, so I think it all comes down to how business is done on the coast. So the policies and the acts that need to be put into place to prevent all of these derelict vessels. So on the coast of British Columbia, there's over 1,600 that have been identified of abandoned derelict vessels on the coastline. There's much more than that. That's just a report that came out a couple of years ago that kind of stated, okay, there's about 1,600 vessels. And until around recently, like the WAVA Act was not hasn't been enforced. So it was it was common practice for commercial fishermen, as soon as they were kind of done with their commercial vessel, just to go put it on the beach. There was no penalties, no kind of, it wasn't taboo at all. It was just, there would be boat graveyards. And we've cleaned up a few of those boat graveyards. Like last year, we removed 33 derelict vessels from one of those boat graveyards in the colloquial territory. So it's really the education piece to let people know that these practices no longer fly. The vessels that I talked about removing were actually on an ancient clam garden, so it made it inaccessible for the First Nations to actually be able to harvest food traditionally. So we're hoping that by doing this work and having this education piece along with it, that in the future we won't have to be around to clean this up. From Canadians making those choices. But as you know, waste on shorelines is it's a global issue, because we find a lot of stuff that that does drift ashore from overseas, and we've done shoreline cleanups in the Heshquit territory since 2017, where I'm from, and it's a continued issue. More and more just keeps coming. So there's got to be a big shift globally for people to responsibly dispose of, especially plastics. Like plastics are the ones that just keep coming, and the microplastics that we find in the oceans are just wreaking havoc. There's I've read about some like beach seines in Clydewood Sound. The stomach contents of most fish that they caught was about 20% plastic. So, and these are little like migratory salmon. So that and it's just, yeah, I think it boils down to education is and then actually the putting policy and acts into place in Canada is a good place to start.
Yeah, and I think you hit it. I mean, the education and awareness piece is going to be key, and I think that's perhaps a good segue into a question I got for Ranah about you know, the plastics you talked about, Josh. There, I wasn't aware that only 9% of our waste is recycled. I think some of the public sentiment might be that it's a lot more than that. Ranah, have you come across whether or not people are aware that it's so little, given the recycling push in the last few decades?
Yes, it's a major issue, and I think, you know, Josh really is correct in saying that we lack education in terms of understanding the impacts of plastic, for sure. I think it's only been recently that we've, you know, audited how much plastic in Canada gets recycled, and I think that number is from 2019. And some further and more recent data might suggest that it's actually closer to 5% that we actually end up recycling, which is worse. It is a major issue because of the way that we don't have a regulation on plastic. And I believe the federal government is working towards better definitions of recyclability right now. But that might be long overdue. Maybe should have been done a while ago. But they're headed in the right direction. And I think banning some of the 10 single-use items that they banned last year was a good start in the right direction. Again, those are plastics that don't even compose what you see behind the scenes. So those were consumer-facing plastics, for example. And a lot of folks don't see the mountains of plastic that are produced through our food supply chains, through retail, through manufacturing. So really, it's the tip of the iceberg that's been targeted, where in fact, we should really be focusing kind of on the back end as well and minimizing it there. So I think there needs to be a lot of education, but I also think we need to take maybe a firmer stance on our regulations for what is actually recyclable content, what is compostable, which there is a huge issue in my industry of producing bio-based plastics because there's no real clear definitions. There's some standards, but there's a lot of greenwashing as well.
Yeah. And to continue that thread of, I guess, education, Tom, I was the slide you put up there about the capacity for carbon sequestration or carbon capture from seaweeds along the coastal, it was fascinating for me. How aware do you think people are of that capacity for carbon sequestration or carbon capture from seaweeds and where they're located as well? That's something that was new to me, and I'm hoping that's something we can get out, but maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, seaweeds there's a lot of good research coming out, especially from NOAA in the States, about the real carbon potential of seaweeds and how great they are. One of the things that really has seaweeds going for it is they're the fastest growing organism on Earth. I mean, giant kelp is really, I mean, depends on how you measure it, but definitely one of the fastest. But they're almost the perfect crop for carbon sequestration in a couple of ways. Number one, they basically sit in a nutrient bath their entire life. So you don't need to water them, you don't need to fertilize them, you have to do nothing. And number two, except for a couple of species, they're mostly annual crops. So not only do they grow super quickly, they also then die really fast. And that dying part is a key piece for carbon sequestration because the plant actually needs to then be sequestered by falling down to the bottom of the ocean somehow. And so with different seaweeds, this happens in different ways, but that's sort of this key missing piece that why seaweeds are so much better than trees. We're seeing sort of on the production side of the people doing this, there's a lot more interest coming from remote and coastal communities, especially those that don't have traditional other sources of income. Because it does sound like the perfect business for a coastal community. If you approached any coastal community and said, "Hi, would you like to clean up your coastline, restore local fish and biodiversity stocks, and get paid for it?" they would jump at the chance. Bonus points if you happen to be a community that's indigenous and you already have an existing relationship with that ecosystem you're stewarding. And so it's just making sure that the market is designed in a way that the proceeds actually get back to that community somehow. And that there is the ability for these communities that don't necessarily have the resources to go hire KPMG for $3 million and do a feasibility study to get access to the tools and technologies they need to then be able to get paid for this kind of work.
Yeah, so I'm guessing that one of the things you offer then is that opportunity to say, okay, there is that capacity in this coastal community for some sort of carbon credit business model to be pulled together early on. Is that fair to say? Yeah,
absolutely. One of the really interesting things that we can do with our technology is we can go forward and backward in time. So a lot of communities can say, "Oh, we know there used to be this huge kelp forest here, this used to be a thriving ecosystem," that it's not. And that's something that's kind of hard to prove based on word of mouth, but it's usually true. But we can use our technology to go through previous banks of satellite imagery all the way back to like 1970 and be like, "Oh yeah, there it is." And then you can use that and show how the ecosystem is degraded, make a plan to bring it back. And that's a clear statement of sort of carbon sequestration lost and then regained. And that's the kind of sort of stamp of approval you need at this stage to get carbon credits from the ocean.
And presumably, and just staying with Tom there as well, this is a global market with the carbon credits as well.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's one of the really interesting reasons we're using satellite imagery is that we can pop sort of anywhere in a global market. especially because a lot of these locations tend to be kind of in storm surge areas or hard to access. And so we're working with, a partner in Namibia who has a seaweed farm. It's where hurricanes form. So they can check their seaweed farm once every month-ish. They put sensors out on that farm, they get whisked away in the wind. They're long gone. And so developing a technology that sort of is allowed to be used in all these different spots with all their unique challenges was really important to us.
That's very cool. Josh, coming back to you just quickly, you mentioned the scope of the challenges are massive. The cleanup effort is, you guys are exceptionally busy. I know from talking to you earlier that there's got lots on, but there's lots to do. What's kind of holding CRS? What's the challenges for CRS to grow that and do more in the cleanup effort?
I think the biggest challenge is we don't have a sellable product. So with how the economy has worked in Canada, North America, it's been extraction based. So mining, forestry, fisheries, it's what you can take out of the environment that is a sellable product. So we're giving back to the environment and taking and remediating the damage that was caused to it, but there is no sellable product. So so we operate 100% on government grants. So through provincial, through federal. So the biggest challenge, of course, is obtaining that funding and obtaining funding that is year after year as well. There's a lot of funding envelopes out there that are one-offs, but when we put all the investment that we do into our employees with all the training and then the on-the-job training, the skill development, and even like more advanced training as they've been with us for a while, it's hard to retain employees on a contractual basis, especially in these remote communities. So it is the biggest challenge is the continuation of funding. Is the biggest problem. So and there's different avenues that we are exploring, and it's more having to diversify the things that we do. As I talked about earlier, we have multiple projects that do so much, that cover everything, because it is an immense problem. I hope that we can clean up the coasts in my lifetime to make things better for my children, but the scale of the problem is that big. It might not be done in this lifetime. So,
and I was fortunate to be on a panel with one of your colleagues for the Coastal Zone Canada conference a couple of weeks ago here, and he also talked about people as well. You mentioned earlier in your talk that you've got restoration technicians, which I think is fantastic because it's a very motivational type of approach that you get people in there, but I presume it's hard to keep those people coming back if that funding isn't as consistent or as continuous as you would like.
Yeah, and it is we do have a really great core team. This past year, we were able to keep people employed through the entire year, and this year is looking like it's going to be the same. So it's just keeping that momentum going, and then being strategic on the applications that we are able to get funded for. So it's definitely challenging, but it is working right now. So we have a core team that has been cleaning up the coast for I guess probably about 15 months straight. So
fantastic. And the training that you guys are doing is fabulous. You talked about the safety training, all of the requirements around getting people to do this restoration work. I think that training component is a very key thing, and that's one thing that the CRS is fantastic at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with like shoreline cleanups, in the past, it's always been viewed as a voluntary kind of a job. So like volunteers would go out and do shoreline cleanups, but it's dangerous on the coast. It is like extremely dangerous, and like it is so easy to have a slip, trip, and fall and never be seen or heard from again. Like, God forbid that ever happens on one of these volunteer trips. But we need to make sure that this is an actual industry that abides by work safe policies to keep everybody safe. And we've developed an entire OH&S framework to and SWPs, SOPs for every single thing that we do, every activity out on the water, to make sure that everything is done according to policy and according to the safest practices that we can possibly use. Because at the end of the day, it's not worth doing if your crew isn't safe doing it.
Yeah. Okay. Ranah, I'm just going to ask you more of almost a personal question in terms of your journey from research into entrepreneurship. I was hoping that you might maybe give our listeners or our viewers a little bit of a description of how you've gone from that research side into entrepreneurship, and what have probably been the key challenges in starting PhyCo.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk about that. Yeah, it's definitely not where I expected to be. For sure, I expected to be in academia and maybe go into environmental consulting based on my academic background. But I think part of the trigger for me to move into what I'm doing is really that photograph I showed in the slideshow. It was the first slide of what Semporna Malaysia looked like. That for me really changed the way that I see the world. And see that the impact that Canada really has when it exports its plastic out to other developing countries, as well as just poor waste management and a lack of alternatives. So that photo was taken in 2016. I started PhyCo during the pandemic, which was about 5 years later. And I just remember working in my field sites in Stanley Park, where I've basically grown up as a kid. I've always gone there since I was a child, and starting to see plastic pop up on my field sites, which I'd never seen before in terms of gloves, masks, personal protective equipment. And I was, I had a lot of time in the pandemic as well to tinker around in my kitchen with some seaweed, and identified some characteristics that I had noticed about seaweed that could actually be feasible for developing plastic. So I think it stems from a place of passion of wanting to really make an impactful difference, and really focusing on not just the innovation, but the social aspect behind it, in that we are on unceded territories. These are the lands of Indigenous nations, and any kind of projects that go forward really need to be in partnership, full respectful partnership with Indigenous nations. So I wanted to see that, to set the standard for what aquaculture could look like across the world, because as Thomas said earlier, it is expanding. You have farmers in Namibia and Chile and Southeast Asia all beginning to do seaweed aquaculture. And often these projects are so large and capital intensive that the communities that are right there on the shore are often left behind. So yeah, I think that's a large reason of why I started PhyCo and where we are now. And yeah, and challenges, of course, I think Joshua touched on it, but funding is always an issue. We're an early stage startup, so funding is always a challenge. And I think in Canada, we're really fortunate that we have a lot of new funds available for startups, but in terms of the longevity of that funding, it is difficult to attain over time. And private investment into companies like ours is a little bit harder on the Canadian side. A lot of other entrepreneurs that I'm aware of have actually gone down south to the States, where investment and capital is much more readily available, and American investors tend not to be as risky as Canadian investors. So those are kind of the challenges in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's some of the things we're trying to break down here at Coast, but hopefully we'll get there and support that. Thomas, coming back to you regarding more so blue carbon's become a bigger thing, I think, over the last few years anyway, and people are recognizing that, especially with the clean tech and climate. Who are the sort of world leaders at the moment, and where does Canada sit in terms of our progress with blue carbon and carbon capture in the oceans?
Yeah. So I'll break it down by sort of general ecosystem. I think that's the best way to do it. And so backing up one level, there's a couple types of carbon sequestration. There's engineering projects, direct air capture. This is, things like directly removing carbon from the atmosphere using some chemical process. And then there's avoidance carbon, which is like the equivalent of paying someone to change from a gas car to an electric. You're not actually reducing carbon, you're just paying them to not emit what they had. And there's questions about how permanent that is. Then there's nature-based carbon reduction, and then you sort of lands and you have ocean. And we've seen a lot of pushback on the land-based and specifically forest-based carbon. And that's because we've been over measuring and I say we sort of globally, have been over measuring what is in forests and how threatened forests are in various places. On the ocean side, we have sort of the opportunity right now from a policy, and this is where this loops back, is from a policy perspective to do this right. So there was a report that was published. They said about 99.6% of all forest-based carbon credits were bogus. And sort of that sucks on one hand, right? Because it means that 99%. And so there was a big report and people said, Delta Airlines claims to be carbon neutral, but is paid $3 a ton for their carbon, and so they're probably not. And on one hand, that is a huge problem because there are people have basically been selling snake oil. On the other hand, that's $600 million of money paid to forestry projects that wouldn't have been paid at all. So it's tempting to be super doom and gloom about carbon credits and where carbon markets are going. But on the other side, it's all pointing in the right direction. It just needs time. So in blue carbon, you basically have mangroves, which we can treat basically as a forest on water. The standards, the measurements, they're all very similar to a forest. If you work in and around carbon, it's a REDD+ grant, which is an avoided forestry grant or an avoided forestry standard. And they come with a lot of the same problems we've seen in traditional land-based forests. On the salt marsh, sort of seagrasses and seaweeds, there's a real opportunity to do this right. And Canada leads the way in salt marsh and some seagrass areas, but they're sort of the lowest, the least ready ecosystem to make it to carbon markets. On the seaweed side, which is sort of the one that's most scalable in terms of planting and growing out, because it's really hard to do a seagrass farm. Japan and Australia really lead the way in understanding those ecosystems and bringing them to carbon markets. Japan and Australia are the only two exchanges of carbon credits that have been actually able to sell carbon credits for a seaweed organization. Actually, there's a Canadian company that was the first to get a carbon credit sold through the Japan exchange called Urchinomics, and they do seaweed restoration. And so that's sort of who's leading the way. I know the BC government is doing an assessment of a protocol right now for BC-based seaweed carbon sequestration. So if you have thoughts you'd like the BC government to know, you can write to your person. If you're in BC, we're in Ontario, so we can't. But yeah, that's where we sort of sit. In the future, this is going to become a really big country for seaweed. A lot of the cold water seaweeds do the best in terms of carbon sequestration, and that means Canada and Alaska are the two places to do it. The only thing really holding back Canada, and by some extension the US, in terms of how to do seaweed-based carbon sequestration is permitting. And that's where Canada has a real advantage, because most of our large sections of the coast are still held in unceded territories of First Nation communities. And those First Nations have a real advantage because they have a tool to go to the government and say, we're going to do this on our own land in our traditional ways. And it lets them cut through red tape. So actually we see a lot of in Canada, the people leading and charging the way are Indigenous and First Nations communities, because they have the ability to cut through red tape, where if you're in California, you're waiting 30 to 50 years before you get a seaweed platform. And yeah, that's an overview of seaweed-based blue carbon and who's doing it.
So it seems like it's a pretty good time for opportunities for coastal communities to potentially use this as a potential to get involved in this carbon credit, and then often potentially use that to help what Josh and the CRS are doing. He's just saying that there's, it's hard to rely on that funding, but there's an opportunity here to almost make it a circular economy type approach. Is that fair?
Exactly. And one of the great things about seaweed carbon credits themselves is you can still sell the seaweed. You get carbon sequestration as the seaweed grows. You get 11 to 14% of it will end up as sequestered carbon. And then you still end up with a seaweed product you can sell, you can use in your community, and you can use for bio-based fertilizers or other sorts of cosmetics, plastics, if you sell to Ranah over there. Yeah, and so that's, it really is it's almost a silver bullet for a coastal community who's looking for a way to grow out a local economy.
I think this is fantastic. We've just explained the whole circular economy between the three of you. I'm not in this, I'm on the outside, but the three of you have just done the whole circular economy. It's fantastic.
Yeah, actually, one more point on that is an interesting thing about carbon is that in every other commodity, all commodities are sort of priced the same. Like if you're buying a ton of white rice, the prices vary a little bit, but you're going to be paying, plus or minus 10% market price. Carbon credits are very different depending on the value of that credit. And so sometimes carbon credits are like $3 a ton. Sometimes there are thousands of dollars a ton of sequestered carbon. And that's really the difference between those two is what other co-benefits are rolled into that carbon credit. And so we see that often these ocean projects go for the highest price, $250, $300 a ton, because they're also cleaning up the community. They're also providing biodiversity benefits. They're also restoring the oceans, and they're providing coastal restoration through something like what Joshua would do. And so by rolling sort of all of them together, you can get a really high price from the open market for your carbon. So there's a real vehicle here to fund a lot of this circular economy stuff. Of course, there are open questions about how much of that is a conflict of interest, how much of that is greenwashing, but it sort of goes back to the first thing, that is, we're going to have to figure out as a sort of globe how this market is going to work. And there will be a little bit of greenwashing along the way. So as long as we just try to keep as sort of a tight leash on it as possible, but accept that mistakes and slips will happen, that's how I think we're going to move forward.
Yeah. Thank you. No, it's fantastic. It's good. It's a really interesting discussion on that one. And I think we have to be a little bit more creative and innovative on how we fund things like Coastal Restoration Society, how we fund, the producing plastics. And I think the carbon credits is an opportunity to do that. So no, I appreciate your viewers on that one. We've got to about 5 or 6 minutes to go. I don't have any questions from the audience as yet. So please, if you want to, please add some questions for our guests. I'm just going to open it up to everyone and talk about, you come from different backgrounds. Josh, you've been connected with the oceans for your entire career and life. Thomas, you've come from nanotechnology into the ocean space. Ranah, more from the environmental. What's the kind of exciting things that you see moving forward in the blue economy and how we're sort of learning better ways to deal with our oceans? And I'll open this with the order you spoke. So Josh, if you want to take that to start.
Yeah, sure. So the most exciting thing that I see, because of the impacts that we have on remote coastal communities, is people reconnecting to the lands and the water. So like it's really something that hasn't been happening over the past couple of decades, like in indigenous communities, where it's getting a little bit, everything's getting a little more modernized, and people aren't commercial fishing anymore because there's not very much opportunity to go commercial fishing. Forestry harvesting isn't happening at the same rate that it used to. So it's really pulling people away from having those technical skills to actually go out and be on the territories. Like just for an example here, I live in Tishadan, Hupichassit territory, where their creation is their creation story comes from a place called Keith Island, which is about a 2-hour boat ride from where they live on reserve. And much of the population in Tishat that I've come to learn have never been there. So when we do these projects, we hire local indigenous people to work in their own territories, and we see all of that knowledge exchange happen. Like we like to work with the guardians, and we like to work with knowledge holders, and also their resource workers, their fisheries, and so when we do these projects, we're bringing local indigenous people back out to their traditional territories to clean it up. Which is absolutely exciting for me, because it's for myself, I grew up as a commercial fisherman, but because of the lack of Area A sockeye, my father ended up selling his license, and then we never really had any commercial opportunity to use the boat. So it kind of just sat there. We used it for food fishing, but I didn't get to continue as a commercial fisherman until I was much older, kind of in my 20s when I started commercial fishing as a deckhand again. So there's that gap of knowledge that I would have learned if there was a continuation of fishing my whole life. So yeah, I think that's probably the most exciting thing, and knowing that like people are going to have the skills to get out there, and to do it in a safe manner. And once they get out onto their land, they're going to want to take their kids, they're going to want to take their friends, their cousins, aunts, uncles, grandmas, grandpas, like everybody's going to join in, and it's just going to be, yeah, it's going to be great. Like to see more people actually out on the coast taking care of it. And when you don't see it, it's hard to imagine it being in the state that it's actually in. So like when we get out there and you see the mass amounts of like ocean debris, like plastics and bottles and all this garbage on the beach, you don't picture that in your mind, especially some of the elders that have gone out on our cleanups. They remember it as when they were kids. There wasn't debris all over the beach. Everything was really nice. So when they go out there and see that, it's kind of just like, it's a real awakening for them. They're like, oh my God, this is a huge problem. So it's really about making sure that like the stewards of the land are back on the land. And I like to think that Coastal Restoration Society provides that opportunity and that capacity to reconnect Indigenous people to perform their stewardship duties. So
it's very admirable. Thanks, Josh. Tom, I'll flick that one over to you as well. What's most exciting for you at the moment?
There we go. Finally got off mute. Yeah, I mean, and we're a measurement company, so I'm biased here. But I think our growing understanding of the oceans is what's most exciting. I mean, everyone throws around the stat that like we've explored more of the moon than we have the oceans, which is partly true, but we're really getting a much deeper understanding, sort of, unfortunately, as we kill off a large amount of the ocean ecosystems, we're really getting an understanding of what was lost. But it's sort of becoming really astonishing about how complex and interesting these ecosystems are and how they work together. On the flip side, for us, that's really helpful because originally we thought the ocean sequestered sort of, on the order of 0.5 to 1 gigaton in its coastal ecosystems. And then 5 years later, it was 1 to 2. And now it's sort of 3 to 4. And I mean, you're just looking at the trend and sort of as we understand more and more of how these ecosystems grow and interact, it's probably going to end up in the 6 to 8 category rather than the 3 to 4. And that sort of understanding in ocean accounting is really the most exciting for me, that we're really starting to drill down and really understand what our oceans are and how we interact with them.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. And I think it links in with what Josh is talking about too, in terms of impacts and stuff. Ranah, just quickly yours, because we do have a couple of questions I want to get to from the audience, but what's exciting for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you, Josh and Thomas, for bringing up what I was actually going to say. So beat me to it. I think for me, going off of what Thomas said and our understanding of the ocean as itself, when I started out as a young biologist, we really didn't know as much as we do now. So I agree with that. What I think is really exciting for me to see in the innovation space is nature-based solutions, and instead of working against nature, working with it and finding ways to restore ecosystems and build kind of environmental resiliency and utilizing natural solutions to solve some of our really big problems that we're dealing with. So I would say just that change and shift in mindset is a really powerful thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go to the couple of questions we have from the audience. One of them is about beyond the funding and technology development for all of you guys. What are the other obstacles that you need to overcome to scale your solutions and get them to market? Let's start with Tom.
Yeah, great question. We're hopefully actually wrapping up our first funding raising right now, cross fingers. So one of those will be crossed off the list for 1.5 years. But really the biggest obstacle for us is carbon market adoption and convincing people to sort of take a bet that we are measuring what we say we are, and we're measuring it to the level we say we are. Because we can do all the feasibility improving studies we want, but at the end of the day, when you're selling a measurement like this and you're informing people how many carbon credits they're sequestering, what their ecosystem looks like, its growth and its health, they have to trust that. And so essentially you're operating a trust-based business, and the only thing you can do to build trust is over time. And so getting that trust earned by the market is probably the thing that is holding us back the most, but it's also our sort of only goal. So it'll just take time. We'll work through it. Perfect. I'll ask Ranah the same question. I'm leaving Josh to last because it sort of ties in towards the end part. So Ranah, what's your obstacle at the moment?
I think I touched on it during my presentation, but again, regulations, that's something that we're really advocating for a change in terms of, including compostables in waste streams. Like I said, not all compost facilities, including ones where I'm based in Metro Vancouver, will actually accept compostable plastics because they're not very well regulated. So I think that is one big hurdle that we need to overcome. And when we do, we can see a massive amount of innovation come from that once we have clear standards and definitions. So that's what I would say is a big hurdle for us.
Perfect. And the last question, and the last one to go to is Josh, but I want to put this under the lens of another question we've received from the audience, and that is how maybe between Tom and Ranah, some of the work that they're doing could then support Josh in the growing CRS and getting that additional funding. So is there opportunity there for the growth of Coastal Carbon and PhyCo to then lead to almost revenue generation for Josh to do his work? Josh, do you see that as an opportunity?
Oh, absolutely. Everything depends on a healthy place, right? The ocean and the shorelines need to be healthy in order to grow kelp. In order to actually have carbon sequestration, it needs to be a healthy environment. And that's something that needs to be, that I think everybody understands, but everybody needs to be on board, especially from a political level, through like the provincial government and the federal government. They're starting to really put their money where their mouth is when they're talking about the blue economy, which is great to see. Hasn't always been like that, but keeping that momentum going and that public opinion on keeping these oceans clean so that we can grow this blue economy. And there is definitely huge tie-ins to the cleanup process, and then the planting of seaweed, and then the carbon sequester for an entire region that can work for remote communities, like Thomas was talking about, whereas just like a First Nation that's a coastal community can have this carbon sequestering. They can grow the seaweed and then produce recyclable alternative to using plastic. So it is that full circular economy, and the work that CRS does and what the nations do for cleaning everything up is a huge part of that. And it can't be, you can't have one or two or three without the other. So we have something that we say in Nuchanoth, which is Hishuk Ish Tsawak, which means everything is one, everything is connected. And I really like this panel because it really proves that everything kind of comes full circle when you talk about all the different things that we're all doing right now. So,
well, thanks, Josh. I can't think of a better way to finish on that. We're almost out of time. I think you tied it all together beautifully with the help of everyone. So I want to thank each of you very much for giving up your time and being a part of today's session. It's inspirational what you guys are doing, and I love hearing about it, and hopefully Coast can support you on your journeys in the future. Thank you to the audience for joining us today. This session will be recorded and posted on our website, and I encourage people to visit canadacoast.ca for more information like this and other sessions upcoming. Thanks, Ranah. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Tom. Thank you, everyone. And we'll speak to you next time. Have a good day, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.